You won't see me running, but you'll get some. Put your mic on.
Hi everyone. Welcome again. There are a few seats up front which no one ever wants, but you know, I'll induce you somehow with candy or extra credit in the class that you don't actually teach or something like that. We'll figure it out. But thank you for being here for the third part of the City Design and Development Forum titled Challenges and Divergences at Urbanism's Edge, or the title that I much prefer, Urban Design and the Barbarians at the Gate. And it's a pleasure. So let me take a step back. I was being kind of cheeky when, you know, talking with some other faculty. It's like, can I have a second title? Like, is this a thing? This is the better title, but we have to have some really academic one too, right? They're like, yes, we have to have an academic one. But I really love the second one. And as we were curating out the speakers, reached out to Shaun, and I was just like, you know, this is the idea, could you participate? He's like, well, I'm not an urban designer and stuff. It's just like, well, the rest of the title is, and the Barbarians at the Gate, here's a description. And really, I'm inviting you because you're a barbarian. And he, more than any other speaker, has like latched onto this idea. I mean, he's even grown out the beard just for this session.
Yeah, I trimmed it.
Yeah.
This is like the civilized version.
Yeah, you're the civilized barbarian. You know, you have to be presentable, right? You're even wearing the all black to fit in with the crowd.
I'm trying to be civilized.
Yeah. But for a proper introduction, Shaun Abrahamson is the Managing Director of UrbanUS, a seed-stage venture fund and network of experts serving startups to make cities better, something that we're all focused on here at DUSP and CDD. UrbanUS, along with Mini, built UrbanX, which I know a lot of people have talked about, an accelerator for startups that are reimagining city life based out of New York. Shaun has been an active angel investor for a while, investing in more than 20 firms between 2007 and 2013 in his own personal capacity. He's also an alum of MIT. When he was here, he was a researcher in the CADLab, which then spun out apart to form a company, Oculus Technologies. In 1999, he was an early employee at GovWorks, one of the earliest startups focused on serving local governments. It was ahead of the market, but like many things at the time, it failed, and probably failed disastrously in the most beautiful way, spectacularly during the dot-com bust. So much so that it was the subject of a documentary, Startup.com, in 2001. I can go on and on. He's well-published, well-written, an expert in many sources, speakers at many places, and we're really happy to be able to add another line to welcome him back to MIT. So welcome back, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me fun. So yeah, I am trying to be more civilized, and I will try and maintain that throughout until people ask me interesting questions. That's the deal. All right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of context. So spent some time at the CADLab. This is like 20 years ago. By the way, everything looks the same. I don't know if that's depressing or good, but roughly everything looks the same. So in the last 20 years, I would say I did this sort of good, bad, and ugly of startups. Ideally, you do it in the order where the last thing is the good one, and then you have some money to go and help other startups. And I've spent the better part of the last 10 years investing first sort of with no specific thesis, so everything from healthcare to media, and then the last sort of 4 or 5 years have been building UrbanUS. I'll explain a little bit what that is. Along the way, went to school in Berlin with award-winning ad people. I was not one of the award-winning people. I just somehow landed up there. And then that's the easiest way to get. I'm generally pretty good with email. But I have kind of an unusual team. So just starting and introduce myself, Stonely didn't go to college. He actually got thrown out of high school for hacking his school network, but built and sold 2 companies, and I met him after he sold his second one. Mark went to Harvard Kennedy School and then somehow landed up going to Wall Street, and has probably done more municipal finance deals than maybe anyone alive. And so we recruited him from Citigroup, where he ran municipal finance. Liz was at the Roosevelt Foundation doing mobility policy. I'm not sure why she wants to work with us, but she's landed up. And then Anthony is a lawyer who can also build companies, which is very unusual. So yeah, so that we have kind of a mixed group of skills, which has been useful because we do sort of 4 different things. So the main thing and the stuff that we'll talk about mostly is we invest in startups that make cities better, and I'll try and explain what we mean by that. So that's the VC part. The capital part is that we've noticed that there's sort of a next generation of assets that are not real estate. They're things that typically cost about $10,000 or less, like residential batteries or electric bikes that are shared, or irrigation controllers in single-family homes. They're sort of weird-looking things that we think when you have enough of them, they actually are next generation of infrastructure. So we're starting to figure out how to fund that. And we have a network, which is basically just ways that we try and connect people. I think my kids believe that my job is email. It's roughly right. I do a lot of introductions. But yeah, mainly just trying to connect people. Teams to investors, teams to each other, customers to teams or startups. And then UrbanUS is a partnership we have with BMW and Mini for really early stage companies, or sort of companies we couldn't work with without sort of more resources in their support. But thematically, the same investment idea. And so, yeah, so we'll roughly try and get through all of these things. I'm hoping that I make the last point successfully. You can tell me if we get there. So, moving on. So, why are the variants at the gates? I'm going to go back like a little bit, more than 100 years. So this is the Pearl Street power station. Pearl Street is basically next to Wall Street. It was the first grid, or formal grid. There was one at the Paris World Fair, but for the US, since we're going America first, we'll do this one. So this is sort of interesting, right? Like if you were planning cities at the time, or you were thinking about designing cities, and this stuff showed up, pretty interesting impact. This was the best demo day ever. This was basically a demonstration by P.T. Barnum using his circus elephants to show that the Brooklyn suspension bridge, which no one had ever seen before, that was using cable, this outlandish new technology, was actually safe. Pretty interesting. So just after you get a grid, you're starting to get sort of new construction tech. And then the thing that's sort of most profound at the time is in 1905, this is sort of a street scene. It's all horses, and then within 8 years, you know, unless you're going around Central Park for fun, there's no point in a horse anymore. But it's 8 years. And so within roughly a couple of decades, you've got private money and entrepreneurs redefining cities. So this has happened before. This is not a new thing. We just think that there's more stuff happening at the same time and faster this time around. And some of the stuff is fun. Like, yeah, suddenly you need to have a traffic light. You've got new problems, right? So the timeline, you now get sort of second order consequences of electrification and cars and anyway. So that's the context, but these are all the original, these are the original barbarians. right? These are the people who showed up and they're like, I don't know anything about architecture or urban planning. I just know that I've seen that there's problems at intersections, and I'm going to pitch this, see if we can make it work. So this is probably the core reason why there's so much private money and so much interest from, I would say, sort of outside of traditional stakeholders in cities. The blue line are metro systems, so the number of cities cumulatively that metro transit has reached. And the green line is Uber, so number of cities that Uber got to within, I think it was roughly 5 years. The 1,000 number is, I think, 8 or 9 years. But the green line is what interests private capital. It's like you can really transform cities. I'm not going to say whether that's positive or negative. I'm just going to say you can transform cities very, very quickly and create value and hopefully impact quickly. But your timing could be off, right? So this is going so quickly that, so this is, has anyone seen Mary Meeker? Do you know who Mary Meeker is? So Mary Meeker is like, if you ever wanted to get here's all the tech trends that are relevant. She does like a 200-page slide deck every year, sort of summarizing, here's all the interesting trends in tech. She's been doing it for, coming up on like 20 years. So Mary Meeker last year presented her slide deck. One of the interesting comments about China was, so all these stats basically show on-demand trips, right? So 2013, no one knew what that was. 2016, we're really enjoying it. What's really interesting is the yellow thing is bike share, right? It didn't exist in 2016, and then 2017, we have a whole new category, and it's a dominant category, and it's taking share away from something that was new in 2000, or didn't exist in 2013. And so this is the other thing that makes it feel kind of frantic, is this is, you know, one thing that feels kind of crazy and it will get investors excited. This is something else entirely. Like the first wave of something new has barely got started and you already have the next thing. We can come back to all the different things that are happening, but roughly lots of interesting tech, enabling stuff, cheap hardware, connectivity, machine learning, I don't like to say AI, we'll debate that separately. Changes in work and how people want to live. I don't know what a commute looks like anymore. I'm not sure my kids will understand what that is at all. Privatization is a big thing, so there's an enormous amount of capital. It's sort of silly how many people I visit who have a few $100 million to invest. There's lots of them in every city, which is crazy. This is outside of sovereign wealth and other sources of capital. Climate action, so there's some urgency. I spent 5 years living in Miami. Started UrbanUS the first time I saw a king tide come over the seawall. I'm definitely a believer. Capital markets, so basically it's becoming easier to connect ideas with money at every stage. I won't labor any of those things. So here's some of the stuff that people are working on. Specifically, these are things that we have invested in. But over the last 5 years, we have looked at, I think in the last year, a little bit over 1,000 deals in 4 categories. So anything that moves, so logistics, transportation, built environments, so anything from real estate to any sort of physical hard infrastructure. Utilities, so typically flows of stuff like energy or water or waste, in some cases food, and then service delivery. So things that you would typically think of as things that a local government would do. In some countries they privatize, but they are sort of community services that you think of usually as local government. I'm going to sort of sprint through these quickly and then we'll dive into some specific ones, but just to give you a sense, Wright Electric is an electric aircraft, short range. They do trips like Rio, Sao Paulo. It's like a 40-minute trip, but they want to get it to be a zero-emission flight. Upshift is on-demand cars. So basically, you can be anywhere you text, you get a car delivered. It's supposed to take all the layers of pain out of car ownership and car sharing. Driver miles is a reward system for ground transportation. So basically, if you track people who cycle, you can reward them differently than, say, people who use public transit. City agencies are using it to incentivize people who currently drive but live next to public transit options. It's really hard to see right now, but they can see all of that and they can incentivize change in behavior. LunaWave is high-resolution radar. So it turns out LiDAR is awesome for AVs, but it really sucks in bad weather. Radar doesn't have that problem, but it's not sufficiently high resolution. One wheel is kind of what it sounds like. You know, stuff is designed by an engineer when they name it because it is what it is. But it's a single electric motor with a battery. You asked, that's what this is my favorite thing. The intent is that it's for commuting, but I use it to do conference calls and just do donuts. Dash is a connected car analytics. They basically track fleet behavior for everything from driving style to efficiency. Robotics does road inspection, so everything around the road, including vegetation, but not for self-driving cars. It's for the asset owners and managers. So try and help them understand where to do repairs. And Kiwi is a robot delivery system. So this is not all of our mobility investments, but I'm sort of going through them to give you a sense of the range of how we think about different interesting problems. Kiwi is very focused on getting from $12 for local delivery to $1. Our main interest is actually zero emission logistics. It happens that all these are basically RC cars, 1/8 scale RC electric chassis, which is kind of cool. So Kyle is the founder of One Wheel and the creator. He is part of what we would sort of affectionately call the light EV mafia. This is a group of founders who work together on a bunch of interesting things. They built Faraday bikes, which was recently sold, so it's an electric assist sort of stylized bike. They've done a few other interesting things, but we met him when he was doing a Kickstarter for this about 4 years ago. He was clearly obsessed with how do you change last mile transportation, how do you make it convenient, how do you make it zero emission. That was very, very clear. What was very interesting in the first discussion is that he'd been playing around with what's the sort of simplest combination of things that you could use to get around. And literally it's 2 pieces of maple wood, 2 aluminum rails, a controller which is mostly your cell phone for lack of a better description, a laptop battery, and a custom motor that they designed, but it turns out it looks a lot like a ceiling fan motor. I didn't say that aloud. But what's been really interesting is the problem that Kyle's been trying to figure out is he can see from the cost curve that you will have something that you can put in a backpack that will do 20 miles an hour and will go about 20 miles. You can see that we can get there, and you can do that for probably a couple of $100s and have it be safe and reliable and not catch fire and all those other fun things. It's currently at $1,500, but he's solved all the other things. And it's really fun, right? Like, he's not pitching people on Save the Planet. He's like, you do not want to go to work any other way. And when you ride this you fall a couple of times, it's like snowboarding. If you can get over the fall part and get back out, it's awesome. So I should have had the picture, but I pull my kids. Our school bus is me pulling my 2 kids on longboards. And then this is our most recent investment, so it's about a month ago. The founder of this company built a last mile logistics company in Bogota. He was about 3 years in, sold the company, and had a friend who'd been working at NASA in autonomous vehicles in a very broad sense. And he sort of became obsessed with the economics of how do you get substantial cost reductions for sort of small 1 hour last mile deliveries. It's about 30 to 40% of the all-in cost of how we get stuff. And he's landed up, I mean, these things are super interesting. There's a lot of people who've done robots. This is the only one on the street that has facial expressions. It's also the only one that people adopt and help and Snapchat and Instagram about, which is really interesting because San Francisco has banned self-driving robots, and when you see them, you can tell why. They are about the size of a small refrigerator, and they look pretty terrifying to an adult. Forget about pets and kids. Yeah, so I mean, so again, like Felipe has picked college campuses, so this is working at Berkeley, it just started at Stanford. It's kind of a good research environment. People expect to see weird things, I guess, and so tolerate. And they've learned a lot of interesting lessons. They've had, you know, someone kidnap a robot, they've had someone destroy a robot, but they've had way, way more people build relationships with robots. Like, we get into the point where people want to adopt specific bots, particularly the ones that look a little bit worse for wear. Interesting stuff. So the reason I started with mobility, I should say, is we think that's the thing that's in the most flux, but we also think it's the thing that has the most sort of new Legos to build new stuff, and it's all getting cheap very quickly. So the sort of end point for us, at least in the short term that we can imagine, is that everything gets wheels. At some point, someone's going to pitch pretty much anything, put wheels on it, and let it move around by itself. It's a matter of time. If I don't get those pitches, I know that we are failing in our ability to generate awareness. But sort of next interesting area for us is built environment. Versatile Natures is automating crane operation. So doing things like, is the correct load going to the right place? Is it being safely handled? So they're using it as a first step to understand the crane's role in construction environments, with the end goal of automating the crane. So having a fully robotic crane that understands the construction plan, understands safety, understands constraints like, you know, passing loads over adjacent buildings, which is a big no-no in New York. Valerie is a vertical farm. Did not think that we would get into food necessarily, but sort of arrived there through a combination of mobility and logistics, and then sort of post-organic, non-pesticide food. But yeah, there's a bunch of vertical farming companies. They've gone really aggressively after automation, so it looks a lot like a semiconductor fab. That's sort of the goal. Star City is a co-living company, mostly in San Francisco so far, in New York and LA pretty soon. Main insight is that you can very aggressively price spaces if you can make the private portion smaller than normal and have great shared amenities. So not a real surprise to anyone. What's interesting about this team is within that model are some really challenging problems, not the least of which is how do you source the right property, location. That's one interesting thing. The other part is how do you how quickly can you go from finding a property to generating revenue. So they're doing things like scanning spaces and quickly generating 3D models and going from 3D models into sort of a set catalog of prefab rooms and subsets of furniture. But yeah, it's growing. It's kind of amazing. They have a waiting list of 8,000 people, and they've done zero advertising. The price is that much better than alternatives. Lockable is a prefab. It's a multifamily prefab. At the time, we kept looking for prefab investments, but everyone was doing single-family homes for some reason. Now there's a bunch. I think probably Katera is the biggest. Skycatch was one of the first drone companies doing construction site monitoring. They are probably the furthest along. They've got sort of deep integration with Komatsu. So they've got to the point where Komatsu equipment is getting feeds from the drone and using that to essentially close the loop on what they're doing and how they're doing it. And then finally, Architizer. I hope some of you know what Architizer is. Okay, cool. So if there's not, you have to move on. So this team we met, I want to say, it's about 2.5 years ago. Nicole was working on machine learning at Stanford. Ahmad was working on sort of the intersection of structural engineering and earthquakes. And they have a third founder who is not allowed to work with them because he's in the U.S. Air Force, but he was a base commander, like civil engineering in the U.S. Air Force. They presented a school project, which was predicting the response of buildings to earthquake simulations. And basically saying, through a range of, green, it's totally fine, through red, it failed. What can you expect in real time when there's an earthquake? They've gone on, they manage, for the state of California, they have the contract for first responders to prioritize which buildings you go to first based on their simulation in real time during an earthquake. It also turns out it's useful for insurance because insurance companies issue earthquake insurance at the zip code level. They don't actually tune the models very much based on the fact that the steel used in construction in San Francisco changed and the code changed in the mid-90s. They don't have that in their models, but Client Concern does. And then another part of the built environment, Swifterra is this is an all aerospace company, have done multiple rocket launches in European Space Agency, multiple satellites programs. They make what is effectively a $15,000 to $20,000 satellite, launches using a weather balloon, and it's a persistent video image of a city overhead from like about 60,000 miles. Lots of interesting applications to have sort of real-time overhead video monitoring. Satellites are about half the resolution, the best satellites, just because they are about 150 miles out. But yeah, they've started to deploy in everything from, there's an auto insurance company that's testing whether they can verify collisions. Yeah, a bunch of interesting applications. But yeah, I mean, this is an interesting example. They are a team that's been focused on remote sensing for their entire careers. And probably the most responsive group of people. Yes, there's insurance, like cities dealing with disaster response is interesting, but more and more there are a lot of planning questions, right? For especially around mobility, can you track how things are moving around? And then the last category, I won't bore you with the government stuff, save that for another time. The last category I wanted to talk about is sort of broadly utilities. So Urbint uses machine learning to target inspections for infrastructure. So gas, water, electric, telecoms. Turns out that they spend a lot of time inspecting things very inefficiently. And so what Urbint is trying to do is say, here are the signals that would indicate that there's a very high probability of a gas leak, and it's correlated with things like recent permit pulls or other things. And so they are building tools just for that, for city infrastructure. Block Power does energy retrofits for affordable housing. A lot of energy retrofits work, the economics work well for larger buildings. They don't work at a smaller scale, and they definitely don't work in low income neighborhoods. So they've actually pushed a bunch of off-the-shelf technologies quite far, like very simple things like watching a steam boiler temperature or watching a fuel tank gauge. These are both old mechanical things in most buildings, certainly in the US, and just putting a camera using some machine vision gets you monitoring tools. Blueprint Power is an interesting combination. So the founder worked for the NAR, the housing developer, but before that worked for NRG on the energy side, and before that worked on Google's energy projects. She designed and built out their first sort of campus solar project. And so what their team is doing is aggregating large building portfolios into power plants, for lack of a better description. You take about 100 buildings at a time, and you can trade on the energy grid. You get really interesting economics. Flare they're doing occupancy detection for controlling. So they basically have built Nest for every other type of HVAC. They can do sort of smart vent controls, but most people are using them for things like mini splits or window units. Radiator Labs is another energy retrofit. They make covers for steam radiators. They get something like 30% plus reduction in energy use, and for a lot of people, it's the first time they've been able to set the temperature other than opening and closing the window. So that's interesting. Swell is another sort of real estate and energy hybrid. They lease very large fleets of residential batteries. So things like the Tesla Powerwall, but there are 4 or 5 vendors up and down the sort of cost spectrum. And they lease those, they manage them, and then they negotiate with utilities to drive the cost down. There's a couple of different goals. I mean, one is the battery pays for itself just based on the energy side, but given people's investments in smart homes, it kind of sucks when you lose electricity and you brick your house. So like, one of the selling points is simply you need residential batteries so that you can continue to have a smart home. And then finally, Ecomo makes water sensors. Roughly, at the time when we looked at them 2 years ago, the test equipment was about a $10,000 piece of equipment that they were targeted to get to about $150. And be able to put it in a water bottle or put it in a faucet or anything like that. The prices come down more, and they're using it in industrial applications and residential. And the goal is simply get high quality water data, or high quality data about water quality. So just 2 more quick examples. Ratio makes a sort of single family home irrigation controller. It turns out this gets used in a lot of other applications. When we first met them, they were working in Denver with the water utility, and they were trying to explain to the water utility that if they could mandate the use of this device in just a small percentage of homes, they could resize the water infrastructure. So you're building water infrastructure with the intention of having people drink the water, and it turns out, depending on the US city, 30 to 50% of that water goes into your yard. So fast forward a little bit, it turns out Amazon invested somewhere along the way because Amazon is their main channel. They've used Amazon to build infrastructure. They have, I think it's something like 400,000 units across the US, all through a consumer channel. And now municipal water systems are coming to them and saying, hey, you have more data than we have about balancing demand. Can we start to deploy a few thousand more devices instead of building a pipeline or instead of upgrading the water treatment plant, right? So they're decoupling the per capita water use with what is, it's a connected device that turns valves on and off. So this may be one of my favorite investments, just purely because if you pitched it to people who design infrastructure, it made absolutely no sense. They couldn't get their head around it. They were not interested in supporting it in any way. They didn't know where the budget was going to come from. You can list the objections, and it turns out that people pulled it off of Amazon because it pays for itself in under a year. And Amazon invested because they're like, okay, this is a category, residential connected devices for water. That's irrigation, but what are you going to do with smart meters? So you're going to wait for utilities to roll them out? Or do you want to deploy it so you can have an emergency shut-off that will decrease your property and casualty insurance? Turns out the second answer is probably right. But it's just weird to me because it's real infrastructure, but it's not being deployed to the channels, and it's not being paid for by the people that we would normally expect. All right, so hopefully we'll have a debate about this, but I'm going to try to convince you that you should love some of these barbarians. Blade Runner fans, they have to be. At least some. Okay, good. So this is, this is sort of, what do you think LA is going to look like? It's exactly like this, actually. So the funny part about watching Blade Runner is, I was thinking they got like all the human stuff like right on, right? It's like, they really didn't miss anything. Like they knew there would still be homelessness. That was not a challenge for them to figure out. They knew, so the technology policy around Androids, maybe that's kind of a stretch. But this is, it's kind of, in retrospect, it's kind of impressive. Or we should say, like, Phil K. Dick got all the human stuff right. But all the technology stuff really sucks. If you rewatch it, it is terrible. It's all wrong. And in fact, the people who've written about the movie call it the Blade Runner curse, because if you were featured as a technology company in that movie, you are dead. I don't know what the causal relationship is, but I mean that it's interesting that I think we spend a lot of time thinking about, can we agree on what the problems are that are worth solving. I'm fairly certain that my team, a lot of people are going to get the technology wrong. We're going to get the products wrong. I don't know what the answer is going to be, but I feel fairly confident about the problems. So to give you an example of this, we had an investor event. So this is all our investors, people who like to invest with us, allegedly fairly smart people predicting the future, or at least giving money to people who are building things that we hope to have in the future. And we said to them, if you go through our portfolio, who do you really want to meet? If you know all our companies, who do you want to meet? Literally, like, no one wanted to meet the most valuable company, and this is like not close. Right? So like, we're kind of screwed. Like, these are the people that are funding the stuff that we hope are going to change. They have no idea. Like, they're picking the wrong companies. This is, I didn't wake up one day and say I love venture capital. I actually don't like it. It's not seriously, like, the job is finding nice ways to tell people why they're going to fail, and you won't give them money. This is just not a good way to spend the day. And your kids think that your job is email, which is amazing. But what the reason that I do it, and the reason that we built UrbanUS is, we think if we could build a fund or a series of funds that is right like 1 in 20 times, that's fine, right? Because I don't know if we can do better. I think that would be considered a great result, and we just need to find an efficient way to test lots of stuff. We are trying to meet founders and help them get through at least an initial stage, some of the first stages of building a company. But they're going to fail. I mean, unfortunately, the math is just the math. There are many, many things that will cause them to fail. Usually, timing is the biggest one, right? Either there are other people doing what they're doing already, or they're just a little too early. And being 12 months off is a death wish, right? You don't have a lot of margin for error on timing. You're spending money every month, and if the market doesn't agree that they want a residential smart irrigation controller, you have manufacturing costs and a team that has to wait till the next summer. That really doesn't work out. The thing that we care about is ultimately impact, right? So, Andrew was asking me, why did I land up caring about cities? I didn't. For a long time, I really didn't. I mean, I loved living in New York. I lived in New York for 12 years. I loved living in Boston. I lived in Berlin part-time to go to school. Like, I love cities as a user. But I had never given really any thought to how they work or how they, it just didn't occur to me. But the thing that got my attention was climate change. And the specific thing in climate change that got my attention was in about 2013. Did anyone follow the work from C40 Cities? Yeah, so a few people know. Anyway, they published a bunch of research, and one of the pieces of research said something like, cities are 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. Right, and so yes, what's the border and where are the suburbs, and yeah, we can debate. Okay, but let's say, like, broadly defined urban settlements are climate change. And then all the other data you can find is, okay, more and more people are moving to cities for a bunch of very sound reasons. So cities are climate change, basically, or at least the way we currently build and operate them is. And so our investment thesis is sort of two things. One is, there's a bunch of things that you can see in the examples that are directly zero emission things. They're either reducing energy use or electrifying or changing how the grid works, but there's a lot of direct emissions stuff going on, and those are generally fairly straightforward things. The harder category of things are the make cities better, and by that specifically we think about density. So we know that density has a lot of benefits, and I'm not going to explain to this group of people what those are. It turns out that there's per capita energy usage is one of those things. It tends to be lower. The problem is that there are consequences that people really don't like that come with density, not the least of which is traffic. Yes, we get lots of applications claiming they've solved traffic. We also get lots of applications claiming they've solved parking, which is causing traffic. We get all those things. But there's public health, there's safety, and so the second category investments that we look for is, can you decouple positive parts of density from some of the negative consequences? And that's our investment thesis. And really what we're hoping for is that if we are right 1 in 20 times and we can do a couple of hundred investments, we can say we've impacted some of the harder bits of designing and running cities. And by we, let me be very clear, collectively the founders are doing all the work. And when we show up and we help with fundraising and we do a few things, but the work is happening. His work is being done by the startups. So here's the good news. Most barbarians are going to go away. Don't have to worry about them. 19 and 20 of them are going to go away. And a few of them are going to completely transform cities. I would urge you to try and meet those ones and befriend them. And that's all I have.
I think we're going to have the microphone issue again. Nope. Yeah, no, not going to work. I'm actually going to start off with a question, and then I'm going to give it to the field. So this lecture series is with the Urban Design Seminar, and actually almost everyone asked a question about how, so you mentioned in your investment strategy in these two things that come from experiences and thinking about cities, but how do you in your investment portfolio think about your role with responsibility for citizens, because your technologies are going to be directing impact on people, especially when you think about the second and third order effects. Some are positive, but how do you think about the negatives as well?
Don't? No. I mean, so I can share, so we write out our investment thesis. We have memos. We don't just keep that amongst the team of 5. We typically send that out to, at this point, it's about 2,000 people. So not to pass responsibility, but we don't assume that we're going to think through all the consequences. So that's one. The other thing, I mean, we spend a lot of time asking people why they want to build stuff. So like, the people who have sort of retold the story of how Uber was started, like it was to go to nightclubs, right? Like it was a way to share an S-Class, like fully loaded Mercedes to go to nightclubs, roughly, right? I'm sure there's more to it, but that was roughly the genesis story. That's different from Lyft, right? It's different from it's different from Zipcar. And I think it makes a difference who is in the company, unfortunately, and we judge that. Like, we make a judgment call. We would, I mean, it's easy to say it now. It was very hard 4 years ago to say that we wouldn't have invested in Uber, because we probably wouldn't have connected with the team. But we trust in the founders. So, like, for example, one concern, the team that's doing the earthquake modeling is doing flood modeling, and they're doing fire modeling. They have some very, very difficult questions, because they are starting to get data, for example, of diabetic people in the population and where they live and which hospitals they might be at. And they are building the algorithm to prioritize responses. Right? What are they competing with? Well, they compete against a 911 system that is sort of, you know, first in, first out. So I feel better about that. But still, you're empowering a small group of people and an algorithm to decide where first responders go. And they've, you know, fortunately, they've spent a lot of time. They've recruited a bunch of companies that design algorithms in and around the space called Benevolent AI, and they're at least being thoughtful about it. But I think, you know, for us, we land up owning a small percentage of the companies. We are never going to have sufficient power, and we have to just make the best decisions we can in actually choosing the founders.
So building on Anthony's question, I was struck by some of the technologies, or maybe all of them, how many of them are filling roles that traditionally have been filled by the public sector, especially the water sensor you mentioned for irrigation. And so obviously there's opportunities with that, but I think there's also challenges, especially in terms of equity and roles that the public sector traditionally are beholden to elected officials or public or ratepayers or whoever it is that in theory there's a sort of democratic mechanism there. So I'm wondering how you see that challenge, and if that even factors into this, fully understanding that this is about, you know, a business.
Yeah, so the second fund that we're building to fund assets is built on the assumption that we're at the beginning of a trend where most city assets are going to be privately owned. And if you look at the funding structure for that right now, if you try and figure out like who owns a private equity company, who votes, there's no fucking way. It's completely, there's no transparency. But I don't see another way that this is going to get built out. Like if you look at budgets in the US, forget about globally for a moment, if you look at US budgets, the obligations for pensions, and I'm sorry to go sort of wonk on this, but like there's no there. Like I don't know where the budget's going to come from. Like the portion of the budget that will be left to do the types of things that we need to do is not there. And the trust is not there, right? Like living in Miami for 5 years, like the mayor is not a CEO. The mayor, if the mayor wants to do anything that looks at all interesting, you have a referendum. And that, like, these are not, like, when we're picking startups to fund them, like, my signal for investment is massive disagreement. Like, it is completely the opposite of a referendum. So, like, I'm just like, I think structurally, financially, and from a governance perspective, the city government's not going to get there. Now, there are shadow governments, like business improvement districts. It's a nice word, but it's a shadow government, right? They've created their own tax system, and they're deploying their own resources, they have their own governance. So our thought about funding assets is that what's interesting about the next generation of assets is everything's connected to the internet, so you know what it's doing, you know what it is. And so you could take something like bike share, and instead of having a pile of cash that's represented by one manager who gets to vote up or down on pricing, you could break that up, and you could say the local healthcare system, if you want to have a say about how people move around, you should fund some of these assets, and then you will be part of the government's process that sets pricing. Like we don't, I have no, like, you can get into like, is this capitalism, like what is it? It doesn't matter. It's a type of capitalism. But the problem right now is that there is no mechanism in private capital. There's just blocks of money that are represented by one person who often, it's not even their money. And they are optimizing for the investors. And so we think that one advantage of having a generation of very distributed, relatively cheap assets is that you can have lots of investors and you can have lots of different governance models. And so we think like simple things like price setting it's not just a private equity person in a room trying to optimize for their limited partners. So we literally are just starting on this, but we're doing it because it solves other problems for us. But I think our concern is, governance. Private firms don't have the best track record. With a handful with a board and a handful of people making decisions.
Other questions?
Yeah, the ratio case is really very interesting, but I'm trying to think of the same, what the hell is going on here? So the history of the electricity was that you started with a small private thing, but then it became a utility in the end, right? Here, you're talking about, so the water utility is there, and it's not really impacting the water utility. It's like a business that makes money on data that sits on top of the utility and sort of makes the utility, or enables the utility to exist even though it's totally unfunded and going to the dogs. Right? So is that what we can do? Can we see this in the future, that the utilities, the electrical utilities continue to provide the pipes really badly?
No, I'm fairly sure that most of the infrastructure that we have now are already stranded assets. There's going to be a point to which, like, if you look at, we'll come back to the water, but if you look at Swell, which is doing residential energy storage, if you follow the cost of residential energy with solar, the grid is about to become the backup generator, and then it's kind of screwed. Like
it works for electricity because you can generate the electricity locally with solar, for example. Well, you can't generate water locally.
Well, so I grew up in Cape Town, and I just went back there. They're about to showcase what distributed water infrastructure looks like, out of necessity, because their water infrastructure, I won't get too much into the politics, but the opposition National Party runs the province, and the national government basically didn't build the infrastructure to punish them and basically cause them to fail. It doesn't matter. It is politics, but that's where they landed up. You'd be amazed at how quickly people have figured out. So there's a whole range of local water options. One is, like, the science fiction stuff is you just pull water out of the atmosphere. That stuff gets cheaper. Like, literally you see material science companies showing up that increase the efficiency of that. You hook it up to solar, you're done. It's finished. It's not the same cost as a borehole into an aquifer, but it's completely doable. And then if you add local storage and runoff and gray water and various other things, it's done. Right? You need people to have the experience once of realizing that the utility can let them down, and then the mindset's done forever. And so we look for that, and it turns out that it works very well. The other thing for utilities is it turns out this stuff works really well for venture capital, right? Because these are not massive assets, and literally the only thing holding back companies that do sort of low-cost hardware is they have to raise maybe 2 or 3 more funding rounds than a pure software company. If you can figure out how to avoid that, every venture capitalist will happily be funding more of those things. And we spend a lot of time, like, that's the problem that we try to solve for, is like, at some point can we go to Ratio and say, we will buy those assets. UrbanUS will become a water operator, and we will go to the utility and say to them, you can buy a service from us every year in Las Vegas for the 3 months where everyone waters their lawn in the middle of summer, which is 2x your base load, and we'll cut that in half. But once we build the relationship with all the customers, we would like you to go away. We want to do distributed water. You guys, like, we treated everyone like a ratepayer. There's no reason for you to be in it's doable, and the irony is that I think a lot of the utilities use in order to operate more effectively are funding their own demise. And I'm totally fine. I don't care how we get there. I'm totally fine with that. Like I don't have any religion on what works. I'm like, it's not incompetent, but like some of these things are so inefficient. You know, the utilities are sort of looking at each other and going like, oh yeah, we know about climate change, and yeah, but we've got to pay for our coal plants. Like we borrowed money. And the banks are looking back at me and saying, you better pay for your coal plants. I'm like, yeah, punish all those people. Seriously, like I don't care. I hope that has it strengthened.
Was there another question?
Yeah, I was curious because you started UrbanUS on the premise that there's new ways to sort of address climate change. How many of the investors are actually coming in though because they want to invest in companies that are looking at this specifically? And how many of your companies are running on that premise?
So there are more and more investors that are coming in based on the premise. But the first year that we went out and we talked about this as a sort of impact first, it took me about 3 months to stop saying impact at all. It also took me about a year to stop talking to impact investors. And the reason is the people that are really great at scaling companies, in other words, helping you to build a company. So one of the tests that we ask companies, just if we think about investing, is can you get to 100 cities in 5 years in some noticeable scale or manner? Most of them are never going to get there, but there's a lot of precedent for companies that can grow at that rate, right? Uber, Lyft, or some of them, various bike shares. I mean, there are ways to scale at that rate. That's what's interesting. But the people who are good at that, anytime they even sense that you are claiming impact, they hear the translation that they get is grows too slowly. Literally, like the venture translation of impact, if you are a successful venture investor, is goes too slowly. And so we sort of taken on, if you look at our internal documents when we review deals, we don't talk about addressable market, we don't talk about eventual enterprise value or capitalization, we talk about impact. That's the language we use internally. I would never do it externally, and I stopped. But our founders, when we talk to our founders, like Kyle, who built the One Wheel, I mean, he will say today, he'll say like, I want someone to ride this thing without thinking about doing anything good, right? I know what I want out of this. I want to sneak the benefit of zero emission last mile, but I don't want to put that on my customer. I don't care why they buy it. If they want to do single track from 3,000 feet, and that's the reason that they bought it, and they figure out one day that they can also get to work on it, I'm the happiest guy. But that's one of the things that we struggle with. It's like talking to people about impact was, and it, yeah, I mean, that's, so we don't, even when we coach companies and we talk with them, we expressly say to them, you know, if you know the audience, you can get into why and how of impact, but in general, it's not helpful.
I have a question about your ecosystem. First of all, so you're a conventional VC fund. That means you have to go out and raise capital. You have to talk to the institutional investors. And you said you had an investment philosophy, but I didn't hear an investment philosophy that they would listen to. Can you explain how do you convince them that you can?
It's really just, it's this preamble. It's like, we rebuilt cities about 120, 130 years ago. It's probably a bunch of new companies are going to come out of that, and that's all we look for. So if
you're not saying that you're better at doing due diligence, you're just in a field that nobody else is.
We are probably worse at everything. No, I mean, in all seriousness, that's not what we compete on. We compete on, I only have to look at 15% of startups founded every year based on the last few years of data. That's a huge advantage. We don't look at, I can just say no to the other 85%. That's our main advantage. And then the second advantage is, When people talk about mentors and building out networks, I know anyone that can't help the companies that we work with. So you don't know about real estate, you don't know about mobility. Like, I didn't have to go and make a list of corporate investors. We're like, mobility is the thing that's changing the most. There are basically three, let's say with China, 4 automotive ecosystems. The European ecosystem, or specifically the German ecosystem, is most interesting to me because they work really tightly with government on policy. They're very close to infrastructure builders like Siemens. So it's the most interesting thing for us. So that's we wanted a German automotive company to help us understand what's happening.
And then you're not a conventional VC in the sense it sounds like you syndicate very. I mean, you have a syndication. You come here, you talk to us. You want to build some kind of machinery of an infrastructure of people that is different from a conventional VC. Right?
Yeah, so I think we realized that we are probably building a corporate VC for a company that doesn't exist yet. And what I mean by that is, I think it's inevitable that we will own and operate infrastructure in cities, we as UrbanUS.
Oh.
And the venture part of our business will be the way that we find those things. So I don't know if we'll ever get there, but that's, again, like, my view on this is, I sort of think about it like, you get somewhere and you wonder who the adults are that are thinking about it or doing something, and then you realize that you're the adults. We have that experience over and over again, and I'm not, like, my motivation is purely fear. I'm fearful that the amount of work that needs to get done urgently is not understood. I go and talk to people about affordable housing. I'm like, good, you've got a 20-year plan. 50% of those plans are flooded. So why are you wasting your time and your money? You've got perfectly talented people here doing all sorts of stuff, which is a total waste of everyone's time. I can't do anything about that. Right, but I know that I can go and find every year a bunch of people who have understood that and want to work on that problem or something related to it. Right, and it may be weird stuff like one concern who has better flood models than the government. That's totally fine. If that's the answer, that's the answer. And I don't have to figure it out, which is the best one. I just have to figure out how to meet them and help them get investment.
Great. Any last questions? Please join me in thanking Shaun for coming out to MIT. Thank you all for braving this snow evening that's happening or something like that. It's not snowing yet, so this event was also in collaboration with DesignX, the platform for innovation and entrepreneurship within the School of Architecture and Planning. So thanks to DesignX for their assistance as well, and it's awesome that some of the teams will actually get to meet with Shaun later today as well. And this is definitely kind of like an invitation to the community to, feel free, no matter where you are in your venture, whether you pitch and get in, or you're just starting off with an idea, or you are going to somehow tackle Shaun and get a huge investment in the next 3 months, somehow.
Okay.
That's
Can I
fast.
ask
Yeah.
people are building a company? Oh, sorry, I should have asked them at the beginning.
So please do reach out to us at DesignX. We're here as a resource for everyone. The next event in the series is after